Welcome to the DESI F&S Calculating Meat Alternate and Grains Calculators webinar. In this presentation, we'll be demonstrating how to use various tools that we have available on our DESI F&S website. These tools will be a great resource when determining the crediting amount of different meat alternate and grain items. There are three different tools that we're going to be looking at today. The first one is the SP30 2012 converter. I'm probably going to refer to this as the Exhibit A calculator throughout the presentation because that's what we commonly refer to it as. The next is the standardized recipe converter. And the last one is the creditable grains in a recipe converter. First off, let's go ahead and look at how to find these tools that we're going to be working with. The first step is to go to our DESI F&S website that you'll see where we're at right now. If you don't know how to get to the Food and Nutrition Services portion of DESI's website, you can simply go to desi.mo.gov and then hover over Administrators, and then you'll see the link where it says Food and Nutrition Services. So that is where we're at. And then the documents we're going to be looking at are going to be underneath the Quick Links section here. And we're going to get to these by clicking on Meal Pattern and then clicking on Meal Pattern again. Now if you scroll down a little ways, you'll see under the Meal Pattern Information section there are three Excel documents, and these are the three tools that we're going to be working with today. So the first one I'm going to look at is the SP30 2012 converter. The website will probably ask you to save this document before you can open it. If it does, I recommend just saving that to your desktop. I have all three of these saved to my desktop as I use them quite a bit on a regular basis. So let's go ahead and open up that SP30 2012 converter. So this is what it looks like. So you'll see over here on the left-hand side, it has several different groups listed. These are the sections where it's going to list out the different processed grain products that can be found on this Exhibit A tool. So whenever you're looking for a specific grain item that you're trying to convert into ounce equivalents, you'll find that grain product in its corresponding group. And then you can enter the actual weight of that product over here on the converter side, on the right-hand side, by entering the actual weight of that product in its corresponding group that you found it in. From there, it's going to convert the weight of that product into its ounce equivalents, and then this green section is going to round it down to the nearest quarter of an ounce. Because if it doesn't reach that next quarter of an ounce equivalent, we always have to round that down to the next quarter of an ounce. So it's going to do that math for you as well. So let's do a couple of examples here. Let's say we have a label for a whole grain frosted blueberry Pop-Tart. And when we look at this label, we see that one pouch equals 100 grams. So the first step we need to do, now that we know the actual weight of our product, is to find that product in its group. So we can look through all of these different grain items in these different group numbers, and if we scroll on down, we'll see that toaster pastry is listed in Group E. And you'll see that it says toaster pastry frosted. And you'll also see that in Group D, it has toaster pastry unfrosted. So you want to make sure that you're reading the full description of that grain item to make sure that you're getting it under the right group. Because there can be slight differences that will determine whether it's in one group versus another. But our product we're working with is in Group E. So we'll scroll back up here and find Group E over on the right. And we know that that product was 100 grams. So we'll simply just enter 100 grams in here, push enter, and this converter tells us that this Pop-Tart label that we have is going to credit as 1.25 ounce equivalents for our meal pattern. And you can look at the actual ounce equivalents and see that it was close to that 1.5 marker, but not quite. So it did go ahead and round it down to 1.25. If you ever are looking at this converter and you were under the impression either by your manufacturer or some other information that was provided to you that this product should have counted towards your meal pattern as a 1.5 ounce equivalent, you can always go back to your manufacturer and get a product formulation statement. This is going to be a more accurate representation of how your product contributes to the meal pattern because it's going to give that precise calculation on how they determined its ounce equivalent. The Exhibit A converter is very much intended to be an estimate when determining the ounce equivalent of your product. So just use this as a kind of guideline and not necessarily an exact science as to how your product contributes to the meal pattern. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more example. For this next example, let's look at a saltine cracker. And we see that a serving size of this saltine cracker is 15 grams. Okay, so we can remember that and then go back over to our groups and try to find the group that this product is going to fall under. If we look in Group A, it does list savory crackers, saltines, and snack crackers. So we know that our saltine cracker falls into Group A. Okay? And then we already looked at the label and saw that our product weighs 15 grams. So we can go ahead and put 15 grams in our converter. And it's going to tell us that our crackers are going to contribute 0.5 ounce equivalents to our meal pattern. Okay? So those are just a few quick examples on how to use our SP30 2012 or Exhibit A converter. Now we'll go ahead and work with our standardized recipe converter. So it's going to open up on this page, and then we're going to go down to the bottom on these different tabs and click on the standardized recipe converter tab. Okay? So this page it looks like a pretty big tool, but it can also be used rather than just using it to convert your meat alternates or contribution amounts into ounce equivalents. You can also use this document to credit the amount of your recipe as well as document your recipe as a standardized recipe. So the top portion of this can be used to document all of your ingredients, the amounts, and the instructions for preparation. However, this section is going to be optional if you already have a standardized recipe on file for your menu item. But the main part we want to fill out up here at the top is this number of portions. And I'll zoom back in so you can see where we're looking at. So the number of portions is the first thing we want to fill in. So in order to determine the number of portions in your recipe, you'll want to look at a recipe that you have on file. So for this first one, we're going to be looking at the conversion amounts of ground beef in a recipe. So let's go ahead and use this first example of the 50 servings. Okay? So we see that our recipe calls for 50 servings, and we're going to be using 8 pounds, 8 ounces of no more than 15% fat ground beef. Okay? So we can go back to our converter, and our recipe is going to make 50 servings, so we'll go ahead and put that in here. And then if you scroll down, after you get past the ingredients in your standardized recipe section, you'll see that we have a ground beef converter. So with ground beef, the yields are already determined in the Food Buying Guide by USDA. So we've already generalized these into a converter so you don't have to determine that yield on your own. You'll just need to find the type of ground beef you're working with based on the fat content, and then just enter the amount of the raw product you're using in pounds. Okay? So our recipe calls for 8 pounds, 8 ounces. So you can either convert your ounces into a fraction of a pound by dividing your number of ounces by 16, since there are 16 ounces in 1 pound. And if you were to do that, you take 8 divided by 16, and you're going to get 0.5. So we can put 8.5 pounds of this product is going to be used in our recipe. And it's going to convert that into creditable ounce equivalents for the entire recipe, then ounce equivalents per portion, and then it will round that down to your nearest quarter of an ounce if it needs to be done. Okay, so this recipe, using 8.5 pounds of 15% fat ground beef for 50 servings, is going to contribute 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternate per student. Okay, or per serving. Okay, so on our next example, we're going to be looking at a recipe for a popcorn chicken stir fry, and I kind of generated this recipe and kind of modified it off of a USDA recipe. And then the label we're going to use for that is going to be a product formulation statement for popcorn chicken. Okay? So based on our recipe, we know that we're going to be preparing 50 portions in this recipe, so we can go ahead and go back to our standardized recipe converter and enter 50, which we already did from the last example. And then, since this is not a generalized conversion like it was with ground beef, we need to scroll on down to this meat alternate ounce equivalent converter. So we can go ahead and put in our product name, which was popcorn chicken. Then we need to know the raw amount used in pounds. So we'll go back to our recipe, and our recipe calls for 13 pounds, 7 ounces. So we can put 13 pounds, and you can either convert this over to a fraction if you would like by taking 7 divided by 16, or you can simply just put 7-16, and it's going to give you essentially the same thing. If you wanted to do that division out, you could put, it would be 13.4375, but it's actually just going to change it back to the fraction for you. But it's whatever your preference is, it's going to give you the same result either way. Okay, so our next step is to determine our yield. So like I mentioned in our ground beef converter, the yields were already populated for us. But since this is a unique item and the yield is going to depend on the product formulation statement or CN label, you'll need to figure that on your own. And if you're ever unsure of how to do that, there are instructions over here on the far right-hand side on how to figure out that yield. But it's simply by taking the ounce equivalent of a serving and dividing it by the actual weight of the product. So if we look at our product formulation statement, we see that the serving size is 4.3 ounces. And that 4.3 ounce serving is going to give us 2 ounces of meat alternate and 1 ounce equivalent of grain. Okay? So to determine our meat alternate yield, we'll take 2 divided by 4.3. Okay, so when I took that 2 and divided it by 4.3, we actually get a yield of 0.47. So we'll enter that 0.47 in our yield section and hit enter. And it's going to do those same conversions for us. It's going to tell us our total ounce equivalents of meat alternate in the recipe, how many ounce equivalents of meat alternate per portion, and then how much that's going to credit towards our meal pattern requirements. Okay? So those are the 2 of the different things you can use on our standardized recipe contribution converter tool. Okay. So the last tool we're going to work with is our Creditable grains in a recipe converter. This tool is going to be used to determine the crediting grain component in your from-scratch grain recipes. In our first example, we're going to work with a dinner roll recipe that makes 100 dinner rolls. So we'll go look at our recipe here. Okay, so we're going to go with the 100 servings option. So the first step in our tool is to enter over here on number 5, the number of portions. So that was 100. And then we need to find our grain ingredients. So in this recipe, we have a whole wheat flour as well as an enriched all-purpose flour. So we need to put both of those into our tool since we have 2 different grain ingredients we're working with. So for our first example, we're going to start by converting these from our weight. Okay? So our whole wheat flour, we're going to be using 2 pounds. So you'll see that we have the creditable grain ingredients here, and we have it broken out into different sections. So we have cups, ounces, and pounds. Okay? So our whole wheat flour, we're going to be using 2 pounds. So we'll put 2 here. And then we also had our enriched all-purpose flour, which we're going to be using 1 pound and 12 ounces. Okay, so we see our enriched flour. We're using 1 pound and 12 ounces. So then from here, the tool is going to convert the weight or the volume of these different grain ingredients and tell us the total grams of grains in our recipe. So we have a total of 1,701 grams of grains in our recipe. From there, it's going to divide it by our number of portions to give us 17.01 grams per portion. Divide it by 16, which is the number of creditable grains per portion. That is always going to be divided by 16. So that gives us 1.063125 ounce equivalents per portion. And then it's going to round it down to the nearest quarter of an ounce. So that means we have a 1 ounce equivalent dinner roll. Okay, and if you're ever curious at this point, if your product is counting as a whole grain rich product, you can look at number 8. If it does count as a whole grain product, this is going to be green. If it is not a whole grain product, it's going to show up as a red box here. Okay? So let's clear these out and do one more example. And instead of looking at our recipe based on the weight of our ingredients, let's look at a recipe by using the volume. Okay? So now we're going to look at a recipe for a cinnamon roll. Let's look at the 50 servings option. And we're going to look at the measurement column rather than the weight column for this example. Okay, so we can go ahead and go to our tool and enter that we're making 50 servings. And for our first grain ingredient, we have whole wheat flour. And our recipe calls for 1 quart and 2 2/3 of a cup. Okay, so for your reference, 1 quart is equal to 4 cups. So we can just simply add 4 cups on for every quart that we're using in our recipes. Since we only have a section for cups, we always need to have how many cups we're working with. Okay? So, and just for your reference, I've already done the math on, because we will have to put this as a fraction. So our fraction is actually going to be 2.66 cups and 1 quart. So we are going to have a total of 6.66 cups of whole wheat flour. And then, just like our last example, we do have enriched flour as well. So we have 1 quart and 2 1/4 cups. So this is going to be 2.25 cups plus 1 quart, which is going to make it 6.25 cups total. Okay, so just like the last example, it's going to tell us our total grams of grain ingredients in our recipe. It's going to divide that number by our number of servings, and then divide that by the creditable grains per portion, and then round that down to the nearest ounce equivalent to tell us how that's going to contribute to our meal pattern. You can see here on this line 6 that this recipe was very close to reaching that 2-ounce equivalent marker. At this point, you could go back and revise your recipe a little bit. Also, I do recommend that you try to complete your recipes using your grain ingredients by measuring them by weight, just because measuring by volume isn't as accurate. So you're going to get a more accurate reading if you're measuring these products by weight rather than by volume. But if you need to revise your recipe at this point, that's a good point to do it. Since you are so close to that 2-ounce equivalent, you could go make those modifications in order to make this a 2-ounce cinnamon roll. So that concludes this webinar on how to calculate your meat alternate and grain contribution using the different tools that are provided on our DESE FNS website. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our office. And if you would like to learn how to do these calculations manually, you can view the Calculating Meats and Grains webinar that is also available on our website, and it will teach you how to do these calculations manually. Thank you.